This video is sponsored by Warhammer. Come friends, allow me to tell you a tale of a place where 8 realms far larger than any planet we may know of are linked. A place which is metaphysical in understanding, where great wars are fought for centuries on end, and alliances are made and broken in a matter of seconds. It is lucky that ancient tomes exist to give us knowledge on such a place, details from the very beginning of recorded history to the present day. This is the Age of Sigmar. Prepare to enter a grim age of spell and steel, across realms ravaged by war. The armies of the God King Sigmar fight to lay the foundations of civilization in the lands lost to insidious corruption and the savage beasts of the wild. With every new dawn, 1,000 battles rage. The future is written in each swing of the sword. We know of the destruction of the world that was, where magic flowed at such an intense level, the raw power clashed violently post-cataclysm and formed what we know as the mortal realms. They are in theory planes of existence, very similar to our own world, yet oh so different. Primitive in both nature and essence, where great arcane creatures beyond our comprehension had taken shape and tribal peoples walked among them as if a spark of the world that was. Not much is known of this time, for it falls to a history long lost throughout the ages. Yet the story was only about to begin, for through this era brought some strange semblance of peace. It was raw, bestial-like and untamed. It would take many years, but there was one who was destined to arrive to these realms. Sigmar, God King of the world that was, he who had somehow by the grace of fate somewhat survived the destruction of his former world, travelled throughout the near endless void until a chance meeting with the celestial drake Dracothion. A bond of friendship was born that day, with the drake teaching the God King of the mortal realms, a place where he may rule again and bring order to something so different yet familiar. Sigmar had travelled throughout the realms, admiring what pure magic can form as if it were oh so alien to him, though encountering the primitive tribes brought some normality to his mind. He saw beings very similar to those he once ruled over and traded with. Old habits die hard, as they say, where if such beings existed, maybe there were others. Perhaps he was not the only survivor of Malice, the world that was. It is unknown for how long he searched, but it is said that he found beings powerful much like himself. They were from his past, and while some of them may have posed threat before, and may do so in the future, in the present they stood united as the Pantheon of Order. This unification of gods had been known as the Golden Centuries, where threats were combated together for the greater good of the realms and their subjects. Under this pantheon, order was achieved, at least for a few mere moments within the passage of time. The tribes had been united, art, trade and learning flourished, yet peace, as we all know too dear, would not last forever. The pantheon would begin to turn on each other, taking the subjects which most resembles their mighty powers with them. First the elven gods left, hearing the cries of the souls of their former people from a previous life. They wished to free them from a fate worse than death, and knew all too well that the Pantheon acted too slowly. The more they waited, the more suffering would be endured, and they could not allow this. Next was Gorka Morkha, a green-skinned deity of brute strength. How he managed to join such a pantheon of order is a curiosity in itself. The god is known to cause destruction wherever he roams, and the others wish for order where all he wants is a good fight. It was no surprise that he rampaged against his former allies. In fact, it would have been expected, as the green god left to beat anything which opposed it into submission. Then there was Nagash, the Lord of the Dead, he who wished to reshape not only the realms, but existence itself into the twisted vision that he held in his own image. Such an alliance had always been a matter of convenience for the god of undeath, but maybe the whole pantheon had similar feelings. The cracks that spread throughout the pantheon had unfortunately influenced the subjects of said deities, where turbulence from such divine beings may cause distrust. sin, and corruption. Cults began to form in the hearts of many nations. It would only take but a simple push, and with that, nightmares may come. As more and more fell into depravity, insidious curiosity, rage, and sickness, the veil within the void had ripped, and now order, or what was left of it, broke away. Creatures born from base mortal emotions began to manifest throughout the realms. Arcane rifts had opened as the mortal realms now found themselves linked to the realms of chaos, and the dark gods spread their influence even further. It may have been seconds, it may have been days, or even centuries, but hundreds of nations were destroyed by the corrupting powers of chaos. Untold souls were sent howling into the abyss, and for the first time in a long time, a true threat had emerged. Legions beyond legions of foul demons and dark-touched mortals swept throughout the mortal realms. The gods of the now crumbling pantheon stood tall in the face of this evil enemy, yet as forces were dispatched to meet them, they had faced a hatred like no other. Even the God King Sigmar himself could not stand against this hateful foe. Knowing full well the battle could not be won this day, he ordered a retreat to Azir, the realm of heavens. Here Sigmar and all that he could save would be safe for at least the time being. Not everyone could be saved, unfortunately, for the mystical gates which linked the realms would need time to close before the hordes of chaos could breach their way in. Many had found safety within Azir, but many others found their demise. Those who were left, hopeless, cursing at Sigmar, craven, betrayer, as the forces of chaos came closer and closer. A choice had to be made: be cut down like a hapless animal, or serve the darker powers. What choice would you make? The period known as the Age of Chaos would last for centuries. How much time had passed we will never truly know, but this was a period in history where chaos reigned supreme. All realms, save for that of Azir, had found themselves little more than a hunting ground as the champions of the dark gods spread their influence. Many mortals had been turned to the gaze of the ruinous powers. They would be forced to serve, or suffer a fate worse than death, as the realms around them slowly twisted and turned into a form representing the chaotic taint that now held such influence over the lands. The other gods of the former pantheon had tried to hold strong. Many had found themselves forced into hiding. They could of course not stand against chaos alone, where even the Lord of the Dead, Nagash, feared such evil. Though others, such as Gorka Morkha and his servants the Aurochs, who take strength from fighting, found themselves heavily empowered, so the constant warring never slowed down. To many, this had been a hellscape. To the Aurochs, this was great fun. Sigmar's isolation within the realm of Azir had not been out of cowardice. In fact, he had only wanted to buy some time. The realm itself had been mustered for war, a grand host to fight back the near limitless tides of chaos, but there was more at work. The God King knew very well his fighting days were limited at best. His strength was not as it used to be, but perhaps his strength could be channeled into warriors that may fight for the light against the dark. As his warriors fought against the growing tides of chaos, and in fact all warriors throughout all the realms, Sigmar kept watch for warriors. Those who showed exceptional skill, valor, and courage in combat would be taken away by bursts of lightning before their last breath. These men and women would form a new army, reforged by Sigmar himself, and aided by the Dwarden smith god Grugni. These warriors would be reforged and remade into a weapon, the Stormcast Eternals. Trained in every theatre of war, the Stormcast Eternals were the perfect weapon. Empowered by their God King to wield the storms, immortality to allow them to fight near endless years, and should they fall, they could be reforged anew to once again take up arms against the enemies of Sigmar. It is important to note, however, that the Stormcast Eternals were not as perfect as many mortals may imagine. They indeed had flaws. With each death and each reforging, these warriors lost memories of their past lives, where eventually these men and women would not be warriors per se, but rather weapons and weapons alone. These flaws perhaps would have been tended to should the threat of chaos not have been such a priority to deal with, but unfortunately there was no time to theorize how the Stormcast Eternals could have their humanity saved. not when the very realms around them mutated so heavily. If they had wasted but a single second, then Chaos may have achieved victory over the realms, and our story today would be over right in this instant. Sigmar's counterattack was swift, unexpected, and bloody. Across the realms, the armies of the Stormcast Eternals descended, putting the followers of Chaos to the sword with a remarkable fervor. But in the mortal realms, nothing is ever won without cost, and foes, old and new, are never far away. The Stormcast Eternals were unleashed upon the realms as a beacon of light against the growing darkness. Lightning would flash across the realms as hosts of these mighty warriors appeared against the ruinous powers. The Stormcast Eternals, remembering all too well that it was Chaos that felled them, and that it is Chaos as to why the mortal realms suffer from such heavy corruption and mutations. Now, it is time to repay them in kind. Reckless destruction was not the objective of the Stormcast Eternals, however it may seem. They were allowed to enact their vengeance, yes, but there were two objectives. Firstly, they had to secure the realm gates in the respective realms that they were dispatched. The realm gates are the link between the realms which allowed free travel, many of which had been under control of the forces of Chaos since the day they burst from the void. The securing of these realm gates would allow further forces from Azir to provide aid. Not only that, but many of the still remaining mortals within the besieged realms could be tended to. Many of them still tried to fight or flee against the forces of Chaos against all odds, and it was time for them to be saved. The second objective could be seen as a moment of desperation. Sigmar once had many allies in the sacred pantheon of order. These gods and their servants still fought against the forces of Chaos, and maybe once more they can fight together again. Indeed, there were many like the Fireslayers who stood strong in their stout hearts, or the Sylvaneth, forest spirits whose years of experience harken back to perhaps the beginning of the realms. Alliances were made and renewed, and together they fought, for only together could the chaotic powers be sent back from whence they came. Despite this impressive alliance, the realms were not completely reconquered, no. Such battles are still to lie ahead, and even then, a new enemy would rise. It was not unexpected that Nagash, the Undying King, had been closely monitoring the situation. From his realm of death, Nagash kept his legions active. With Chaos slightly entertained, it was now time to strike and retake his territories. His enemies could deal with each other, as he had no interest in joining the fray while they were all still too strong. He began construction of mighty black pyramids, floating bastions of his dread, which would resonate the powers that lay within his control. Through his pyramids, Nagash channeled the necromantic powers that had been concentrating in an effort to unleash a terrible spell across the mortal realms. Unfortunately, however, his plans were disturbed by the Skaven, an ancient enemy of his. They, however, could not stop his malice, as a shockwave known as a necroquake shook the very foundations of the mortal realms. Legions of the dead rose. Spirit, skeleton, and vampire unleashed their undying fury onto the living, be it Sigmarite, demon worshipper, greenskin, or any other. All are potential slaves for Nagash, and all will eventually serve. Nagash had empowered his pyramids, including one grand pyramid to such a degree that the realm of death itself withered under their power. Reality and magic would bend under the whim of the necroquake, and forever would change the basic laws of magic throughout the realms. Nagash's legions threw themselves at all who stood in their way. His goal was to topple the Varanspire, a location held by Archaon the Everchosen, and if it fell under his control, then all of the mortal realms, or perhaps the cosmos, would be ripe for the taking. The tenacity of the living, however, would put an end to his plans, at least for now, but still the legions of death march out of the realm and invade those of the living. There are no easy means by which to reclaim all that was lost during the Age of Chaos. The gains made by the forces of order are but drops in an ocean of darkness. New empires must be raised from the bones of the old, and so a crusade has been called. A crusade waged with faith as much as steel or gunpowder. With the forces of chaos and death repelled at least ever so slightly, it was now time. Time to launch an offensive to reclaim all that was lost. Mortals were fighting at all conceivable sides, but such is the fate of a kingdom's founding. Many horrors lay waiting to strike without a moment's notice. Be you man, elf, Dwarden, you must be ready. Many have lay in wait within the realm of Azir while the Age of Chaos passed, and now it was time to reclaim that which was lost, a sentiment shared over and over. This was the Dawnbringer Crusade. Sigmar's forces went on the offensive, joining with any allies of old to repel the chaos-tainted forces that had claimed their borders and realm gates so long ago. The forces of order knew well enough that this time, foundations must be built as the expansion pushed ever forward, new bastions erected, new settlements and towns founded. While the main force pushed the enemy back to their own domains, others must purify the tainted lands. It is here where the forces of order will find their true selves as they founded cities within the newly reclaimed lands. Those who had spent so much time in wait within Azir but had no connection to the realm itself found such a connection with another realm, taking on aspects and influence of their new, intended homes by fate. Not every Sigmarite is the same, for while many do have the same goal, to eliminate the threat of chaos, they are influenced by their own realm. It is why many man, Dwarden, or elf can be so similar yet so drastically different. These crusades vary in size. It is very dependent on how many forces are needed, and in truth, how many forces can be spared. Legions of vast size may not be needed in the realm of Hysh as they may be needed in the realm of Ulgu, for example, as it is all dependent on the threat at the moment. Because of this, and the ever-unknowing threat of chaos, some of the crusades have indeed failed. Not every war can be won. Those who succeeded in their efforts, of course, now face the long and laborious task of rebuilding and purification. It is naturally not something that can be solved within a matter of years. Unfortunately, fighting back the forces of chaos, or Nagash, is not the only thing that the Sigmarites need to worry about. As they move further and further into the mystical realms and build their great walled cities, the natural denizens of the realms at this point had become more and more aggressive to these new inhabitants, especially as new bestial forces reawoke. From Gairan to Shaish, the forces of destruction are on the rampage. Greenskins, Augurs, and Gargants march in the thousands, the ground shaking beneath their stomping tread. Yet it is in Gur where the beast will strike the hardest. For an ancient terror stalks the plain, its aim only to cast down and destroy. The forces of destruction had admittedly been very silent, or at least that is what the Sigmarites believe. In fact, they had been doing what they do best: fight. Rampaging Aurochs, Grots, Augurs, and Gargants had been spending centuries fighting against the forces of chaos, and to some degree each other. Such things were always expected. But now as the dead and the civilized become much more prominent, their attentions had turned to them. Why not fight these new foes? They could be fun. The Stormcast Eternals had appeared from the skies to claim territory. The Aurochs, on the other hand, saw them as a gift from Gorka Morkha, their patron deity, to test their choppers or clubs. Understandably, since the forces of destruction had been so prone to fight amongst each other, they were not so much of a threat. At least, that was almost an age ago. Now something ancient and terrible walks among them, a great beast which causes the very ground to shake and crumble as he walks, and his thunderous roar can be heard from many leagues away. Imprisoned long ago by creatures far more ancient than Sigmar himself, he slumbered until there was such a time that he was able to break free. It was during the Soul Wars so long ago that such a time had appeared. During its end, life began to surge across the realms, setting the forces of destruction into a frenzy that their living god had awoken in a rage and broke free from his prison, walking across the realm of beasts to find that it had been so radically changed since his absence, and in a bestial rage he called the warring tribes to war. There is but one simple rule here: hunt or be hunted. This has been lost to time, but now it is the only rule in the realm of beasts. His path of destruction of course did not go unnoticed. The return of such a primal god, whose very savage aura attracted warriors of untold thousands, would naturally cause some concern to other ruling leaders. This primal deity, Kragnos they called him, was a threat that had to be tackled now before it was too late. Sigmar led his armies to meet Kragnos and his forces, but he knew full well that he could not act alone. Calling upon the aid of Morathi Kane and her elven forces to bring swift blades to the battlefield, and Lord Croak, the mystical Slann, with his cold-blooded armies. They met the forces of destruction in a brutal and titanic war. Despite many lives lost, the forces of order knew well enough that Kragnos would not be destroyed on this day. Instead, they would simply divert him, with Kragnos raising even larger armies as he rampaged throughout the realm of beasts. Our story does not end here, however, for such a war can naturally have surprises. There are tales of Aurochs sightings all across the realm of beasts, but only they are not the same Aurochs that we all know. They are tall, lanky, and some may even say more cunning than brutal, amassing in large numbers as if it were the swamplands of the realm of beasts that had called them to war. These so-called new Aurochs were fast, fighting with bolt weapons and far more tactical than their brutal cousins. These were the Cruel Boys. News of these Aurochs had travelled fast. Many of these hordes were travelling across Gur and destroying anything that the God King Sigmar had built up. This could not be allowed to continue. Was the God King desperate, or simply concerned? Kragnos' forces were swelling, while his needed more strength. It would be fate that Grungni, the Duodin god of mining and smithing, had returned from his long travel. He had originally helped create the Stormcast Eternals many centuries ago, and now he returns with new knowledge to improve on their original design. It was not enough that the Stormcast Eternals drew strength from the Tempest of Azir, but now also the Fury of Gur. They were known as the Thunderstrike Stormcast Eternals, and now they marched to war. Gur, the realm of beasts, home to hunters and monstrosities alike, is now the epicenter of a new and feral era of war. The forces of order and destruction clash over these primeval lands. Courage and fortitude set against savagery and brutality. Yet, now a sinister force lurks in the shadows, preying upon Sigmar's people. Many of the Thunderstrike Stormcast Eternals were from Gur in life, and it was only natural that they wished to defend it from the savage greenskins, augurs, and gargants that lay waste to the many citadels of the forces of order. It is recounted that once the Thunderstrike Stormcast Eternals were unleashed, many made way to various towns and cities that were known to be under assault. We know of Crowhotch Creek, a quaint little mining town which had been just a few leagues away from a great battle. Forces were dispatched to that location to see if the town had suffered any losses, or if the enemy had taken residence within the caves. But they were not prepared for what they saw. The town had changed drastically since last any soldier set foot upon it. The land beneath the town had transformed into a marshland and swamp. There were no survivors to be found, no bodies at all to be in fact, as if they had simply vanished. This was not the only settlement that suffered this fate. Further villages and towns had been cleared of their inhabitants. Foul mists surround the towns once full of life, and all too same would the town also be settled atop of a swamp or marshland. It would not take long for them to find the perpetrators. While they were fast moving from settlement to settlement, the Thunderstrike Stormcast Eternals were faster. It was at Zalzagor's Hope where the Cruel Boys had first made themselves properly known to the forces of order. These greenskins had been scavenging scrap among the ruins. The crude metal would serve nicely to add to their already patchwork armaments. The defilement of the ruins, of course, threw the Stormcast Eternals into a rage. How dare these creatures scavenge these towns sounds like rats and vultures. Battle was joined with the Stormcast Eternals steeling themselves as they fight an enemy that they had been so familiar with, but oh so different. These greenskins, instead of fighting brutally in close combat, used tactics like a battle-hardened organized force. Grots threw crude bombs which could even scorch Sigmarite plate. A deadly wave of smoke and fire would engulf the battlefield as Stormcast met Greenskin. Though the Sigmarites would eventually win this brawl, and the cruel boys sent running into the swamps surrounding the settlement, the war was far from over. They now knew the severity of the situation. These Greenskins were swarming all around the realm of beasts, and they would not be defeated easily. The cruel boy Aurochs, insidious greenskins with a cunning streak a mile wide, had long dwelt in Fondia, raiding under the cover of choking swamp mists. But now, with Kragnos on the rampage and Destruction's star ascendant, they wished to harm their enemies and the land itself, so much that neither could ever recover. To think that the cruel boys had only come into existence in recent times would be understandable. In fact, due to the fact that they had been hiding within their swamps and fought under cover of the mists, many would attribute their attacks as that of another force. But long have the cruel boys existed, embodying the cunning of Mork, one of the twin heads of the Uruk deity Gorka Morkha. Perhaps fighting from the shadows had made their influence over the lands to be forgotten about, or this is precisely what they had wanted: fight from the mists unseen and nobody would suspect them until the time was right. Under the command of the killer boss Gazog, after receiving visions from a stranger known as the Mouth of Mork, did the cruel boys rise. The vision Gazog had received gave him knowledge of a potent sludge broth, a weapon of ancient times, when in fact the cruel boys ruled over a large majority of the realm of beasts. This broth was known to drive anyone who had not spent their whole existence inhaling such fetid fumes that radiated from it insane, and to those, unlike the cruel boys, who secreted curious toad-like oils, it was terribly acidic. But that was not all. In fact, all that we've discussed is perhaps the weakest points of this weapon, however strong they may be. This primordial weapon is far more devastating, acting as a poison to the very ley lines of the realms, and it could cause devastating destruction throughout all the mortal realms if handled correctly. Some ingredients were needed: black sulfur crystals traded from the chaos-worshipping Dwarden, organs harvested from sludge worms, and bog lampreys, slivers of arcane constructs that roamed the deepest marshes. Gazog had assembled a large number of bosses in an effort to acquire these ingredients quickly and naturally to keep himself safe. It would not take long for the ingredients to be under Gazog's oily hands, but the elixir could not be unleashed at full force just yet. Testing, of course, would need to happen. As you can expect, the settlements that we had only just spoken about minutes ago, where the Stormcast Eternals had arrived to find swamplands and mists, were these exact tests. Town by town would fall, even some bastions were not safe, as the cruel boys fell upon them in a mist-covered haze. Small pockets of land would be twisted and turned into these new swamplands, and soon enough, with their testing completed, the elixir would be mass-produced. Soon enough, the rest of the realm will be theirs. The cruel boy scheme was truly diabolical, not least because it possessed a significant chance of success. Gazog had bound a war to his cause and already seized the leyline nexus he needed to enact his foul plan. Only the desperate heroics of the Stormcast Eternals stood a chance of thwarting him. Amberstone Watch stood as a bastion to hold off the greenskin tide, or at least so they had hoped. The mist came swiftly, engulfing the region in the dread that was to come. Even the Stormcast helming the defense knew well enough that this was an enemy that would not be defeated lightly. They could not blindly charge into the mists, nor could they also wait for it to claim them. They would send small forces into the unknown, and as they closed in, red eyes watched from the murk. The land around them had already begun to change, and the eyes watching came ever closer. Shield walls were formed in defensive measures, but what is that to hold against the very air that surrounds them? Hobgrot incendiary grenades crashed onto armor as greenskin blades slipped through the cracks. Still, the forces of order pressed on, slaying any who dared to meet them in close combat. Eventually, these greenskins would break, and the battle had been won as they fled further into the mists. But the war was far from over. What they had met was but a small force, as a much larger gathering had been encircling Amberstone Watch from all sides, and the mists were getting thicker. No light could penetrate them, as the very land itself roared in agony and rage. Whatever the greenskins were planning, it was near completion. Gazog himself would unleash a mighty battle cry as the cruel boys fell upon the Stormcast Eternals. What will happen in this war between two great forces? Well, that, my friends, is a story for another day. This video is to serve as an introduction to the universe of Age of Sigmar, which we all know is now entering its 3rd edition, and has received some rather big changes. Of course, this video does not cover everything which has happened throughout the setting so far, but rather the most important notes. In fact, at this point, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor of this video. Our friends from Warhammer reached out in an effort to promote Age of Sigmar a bit further, and they kindly sent over one of the new starter kits, where they sent me over the EXTREMIS starter kit and one of the new painting sets. That was honestly really nice of them, as all the lore that has been mentioned in that book is what I took as inspiration for this video. I've been reading over all the changes to 3rd edition, and it also seems that this is a perfect time to start if you're considering starting up an army. I myself was very curious about the Cruel Boys when they got announced, and I'm looking to build up these forces in a custom paint scheme. Unfortunately, I've not been able to start too much on it, so I'm not showing the models off in the video, as I got sent into isolation the day I was going to buy Primer. Yeah, I know, it can only happen to me, guys. You all know me too well. However, the models look absolutely fantastic. I'm really curious about those Hobgrots. They look really cool, and there's loads of different references, like for example the Chaos Dwarden. It looks like Age of Sigmar in its 3rd edition is really picking up some steam, and I'm really curious to see how it picks up in the future when it comes to extra models and of course new lore. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of new lore. Again, a special thank you to our friends at Warhammer, as admittedly I'm not the best painter, so if I would have been asked to do a painting showcase, I probably wouldn't have done too well with it. So it was really nice of them to offer the opportunity to cover lore, as I was rather curious to see how things have changed and how things are lining up for the new edition. I've got to say, the more I've read through this, the Cruel Boys just sound super cool. It's very different to what we've seen from Destruction so far, and I like the whole cunning aspect, being a bit sneaky. Variety is very important within the Warhammer settings, as we are all too aware, and I can't wait to paint these guys up and, well, probably lose a few times until I start finding my bearings. For some reason, I always learn more by playing than I do by reading about the rules, though I'm assuming that I'm not the only one. What do you guys think about the setting so far? And perhaps do you want to see more videos in the future focusing around different events and factions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion.